History is full of secrets, crimes that almost no one talks about. From deadly prison camps to hidden wartime plots, the past is darker than you think. Tonight, we uncovered true events that shocked the 1860s United States. Stay tuned, some of these stories are stranger than fiction. The water looked calm. It was dark, quiet, still. Then the river exploded. A Union ship moved slowly through southern waters in 1864. The crew could not see danger. They heard no warning. There were no enemy cannons firing from the shore, no soldiers charging from the trees. But under the surface, hidden in the muddy water, death was waiting. Suddenly, a blast tore through the hull. Wood shattered, smoke filled the air. Men were thrown across the deck. Some fell into the river. Others screamed for help. This was not a normal attack. It was something new, something secret, something terrifying. It was a torpedo, not the kind we know today. In 1864, a torpedo meant an underwater mine, a hidden explosive placed beneath rivers to destroy ships from below. And the Confederacy had started using them in a desperate effort to stop the powerful Union Navy. But who built these hidden bombs? Who placed them in the dark water? And how did this secret weapon change the war? To understand that explosion, we have to go back to the beginning. The year was 1864. The Civil War had been raging for 3 long years. The Union controlled most major rivers. Its navy blocked southern ports. Supplies could not easily move in or out of Confederate territory. The South was running out of options. Union ships traveled along the Mississippi River and other waterways like floating highways. They carried soldiers, food, weapons, and hope for the North. The Confederacy knew that if they could not stop those ships, they would lose everything. So the Confederate leaders turned to something new, something secret, something that felt almost like science fiction. They began experimenting with underwater explosives. One of the key figures behind these devices was a Confederate officer named Gabriel J. Rains. He believed hidden explosives could defend southern waters. Instead of attacking ships with cannons, he would attack them from below. Rains had already experimented with landmines earlier in the war. Now he focused on rivers. These torpedoes were simple but deadly. Barrels or metal containers filled with gunpowder were placed beneath the water. Some were tied to triggers. Others exploded when a ship touched them. They were invisible, and that made them terrifying. Union sailors began to fear the water itself. Every ripple could hide death. Every quiet stretch of river might contain a bomb. This was not just war. It was psychological warfare. The Confederacy planted torpedoes in rivers near key cities like Mobile and Charleston. They wanted to protect ports. They wanted to slow Union advances. They wanted to send a message: you are not safe. For the Union Navy, this created a new kind of fear. Sailors could not see these weapons. They could not shoot them in a normal way. Ships began moving slower. Crews used poles to probe the water ahead. Some sailors were assigned the terrifying job of searching for torpedoes by hand. Imagine reaching into dark, muddy water, knowing a small mistake could blow you apart. That fear spread quickly. Union newspapers reported explosions. Some ships were badly damaged, others sank. Even when torpedoes failed to explode, they created panic. But not everyone agreed with this tactic. Some Northern leaders called torpedoes cowardly. They argued that hidden explosives were dishonorable. Even some Southerners felt uneasy about them. Yet the Confederacy defended their use. They said the Union blockade was choking their people. They said this was the only way to fight back against a stronger navy. War was changing, and technology was changing with it. By mid-1864, Union forces knew they had to respond. They created special units to remove torpedoes from rivers. Sailors carefully dragged chains between boats to detonate hidden explosives safely. It was slow, Dangerous, nerve-wracking work. Sometimes the torpedoes exploded during removal. Men were injured, some were killed. Still, the Union kept pushing forward. One of the most famous examples of torpedo warfare happened in southern waters where multiple Union ships struck underwater explosives. The blasts shocked commanders. They proved that these hidden weapons could work. But there was another side to this story. Confederate operatives who placed these torpedoes risked capture every time they entered the water. If caught, they could face military imprisonment or worse. The Union did not treat torpedo planters kindly. They saw them as saboteurs, as terrorists, as men who attacked without warning. Captured operatives were questioned. Some were jailed in military prisons. Others faced harsh punishment for using what many considered an unfair weapon. The legal rules of war were still developing. There was debate. Were torpedoes legitimate military tools, or were they acts of terror? The argument was fierce. Meanwhile, explosions continued. Riverbanks trembled. Ships burned. Sailors whispered about invisible enemies below the surface. And then came a moment that changed everything. A Union ship moved forward despite warnings. Officers believed the path ahead had been cleared. It had not. A massive explosion ripped through the vessel. The blast was so strong that pieces of the ship flew into the air. Men were killed instantly. Survivors clung to debris in shock. This was proof. The torpedo program was not just an experiment. It was deadly. And now Union commanders wanted answers. Who was organizing these attacks? How many more torpedoes were hidden? And how far would the Confederacy go? As investigations began, Union forces started hunting the men behind the underwater bombs. Patrols increased. Arrests followed in certain areas where sabotage was suspected. The river had become a crime scene. The story was no longer just about weapons. It was about responsibility. It was about fear. It was about a new kind of warfare that blurred the line between soldier and saboteur. And as Union forces prepared for one of their biggest naval operations in southern waters, they knew one terrifying truth. The water ahead was filled with hidden death, and they were sailing straight into it. What happened next would shock the nation and prove that the Confederate Torpedo Plot was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. In Chapter 2, we will follow the Union fleet as it enters mined waters, uncover the men who built these underwater bombs, and see how prison cells and military trials became part of this secret war beneath the surface. Stay with me. The ships moved forward anyway. Cannons roared, smoke filled the sky. The Union fleet pushed into southern waters in 1864, determined to break Confederate defenses once and for all. Then it happened. A thunderous blast exploded beneath one of the lead ships. The water shot up like a dark fountain. Wood splintered. Men were thrown to the deck. The sound was not just loud, it was deep, like the river itself had cracked open. The Union sailors froze. They knew what it meant. Another torpedo.
The attack took place during the Battle of Mobile Bay in August 1864. Confederate forces had planted underwater mines across the entrance to the bay. The harbor looked calm from the surface, but beneath it, hidden explosives waited like silent traps. When the Union ironclad USS Tecumseh struck one of those torpedoes, the explosion was devastating. The ship rolled and sank quickly. Many sailors went down with it. Panic spread across the fleet. Some captains wanted to turn back. The water ahead was filled with hidden bombs. No one could see them. No one knew how many there were. For a few long moments, everything stopped. Then, Admiral David Farragut made a choice that would become famous. He ordered the fleet forward. The ships moved through the minefield, slowly, carefully, expecting death at any second. Some torpedoes failed to explode. Others had become weak from time in the water. By what many later called luck or fate, most of the Union fleet passed through safely. Mobile Bay fell to Union control, but the message was clear. The Confederate torpedo system worked. It had sunk a powerful Union ironclad in seconds. It had created fear in one of the most important naval battles of the war, and it had forced even experienced commanders to question every move. After the battle, Union officials became even more determined to hunt down the men behind these underwater weapons. They began investigating how the torpedoes were built and who was responsible for placing them. At the center of it all was Gabriel J. Rains, the Confederate officer who had pushed for the use of mines both on land and in water. Rains believed torpedoes were not cowardly. He believed they were smart. He saw them as defensive tools to protect weaker forces from stronger enemies. He argued that hidden explosives were no different from hidden traps used in earlier wars, but many in the North disagreed. Union newspapers described torpedo planters as sneaky attackers who hid behind technology. Some editorials called the weapons barbaric. Others compared them to acts of terror because they killed without warning. The debate grew louder as more reports of explosions came in. In rivers near Charleston and other southern cities, Union patrol boats were damaged or destroyed. Sailors developed constant anxiety. They tapped the water ahead with poles. They dragged heavy chains between small boats to trigger mines safely. Even when no explosion came, fear remained. Imagine sailing across a quiet river and wondering if the next ripple would be your last. That fear was part of the Confederate strategy. The torpedo program did not rely on large armies. It relied on secrecy. Small teams of Confederate operatives worked at night. They rowed quietly into dark waters carrying explosive devices. They lowered barrels filled with gunpowder into muddy riverbeds. They carefully attached triggers designed to explode when touched. It was dangerous work. If a torpedo exploded too early, the men planting it could die instantly. If Union patrols spotted them, they could be shot or captured, and capture meant prison. Union forces treated torpedo planters as serious threats. When suspected saboteurs were arrested, they were held in military prisons. Interrogations followed. Officials wanted details: how many mines, where they were placed, who gave the orders. Some prisoners refused to speak. They believed they were defending their homeland. Others faced harsh confinement or waiting trial. Military prisons during the Civil War were strict and cold. Prisoners were often confined in stone cells or wooden barracks under heavy guard. Food was basic: hard bread, salted meat, sometimes beans. Conditions depended on location, but comfort was never guaranteed. For torpedo suspects, there was also uncertainty. Would they be treated as regular soldiers or as criminals? The laws of war were not clearly defined for underwater mines. Some Union leaders wanted severe punishment to discourage further sabotage. Others quietly admitted that mines were effective and might even become common in future wars. As the months passed, Union engineers worked harder to counter the threat. They studied captured torpedoes. They examined their design. They tried to improve removal techniques. Naval crews were trained to watch for unusual objects floating in the water. Specialized teams were formed to clear rivers before major operations. Still, accidents happened. One Union vessel investigating suspected torpedoes triggered an explosion during removal. The blast injured sailors who had been trying to make the water safe. It was a cruel twist. Even when trying to stop the threat, danger remained. Meanwhile, Confederate leaders saw the torpedo program as proof that innovation could balance power. They could not match the Union ship for ship, but they could turn rivers into traps. And that idea, that a hidden force could use hidden weapons to strike a stronger one, would echo through history. Back in northern cities, families of sailors worried. Letters home described fear more than glory. Sailors wrote about scanning the water constantly, about sleeping lightly,
about the strange quiet before an explosion. The psychological impact was real. The torpedoes did not need to sink every ship. They only needed to make the enemy afraid. As 1864 moved towards its final months, Union forces tightened their grip on southern ports. Confederate resources were shrinking, but the torpedo fields remained active in certain areas. And then came another shocking discovery. Union troops uncovered evidence that torpedoes were not just placed in open battle zones. Some were hidden near civilian shipping routes. The lines between military target and general disruption blurred. Was this still defensive warfare, or had it become something darker? Officials argued behind closed doors. Some demanded public condemnation of torpedo warfare. Others quietly studied the technology for future use, because deep down they knew something important. This was not the last time underwater mines would be used. The Confederate Torpedo Plot had opened a door to a new kind of war. As Confederate cities began falling one by one, Union forces captured more documents, more equipment, more clues about how wide the torpedo network had spread. And among those discoveries was information suggesting that additional explosive fields were still active in strategic waters. Even as the war neared its end, danger remained beneath the surface. One final clearing mission was ordered in a key southern river channel. Sailors moved carefully, dragging chains, watching for bubbles, listening for the smallest unnatural sound. Then, a sudden jolt, a sharp metallic scrape beneath the hull. The crew froze. Had they just triggered another Confederate torpedo? The water trembled, and in that split second, every man on the deck understood something chilling. The war might be ending on land, but under the water, it was still waiting to explode. In Chapter 3, we will uncover what happened during that final operation, what became of the torpedo leaders after the Confederacy collapsed, and how this secret weapon changed the future of warfare forever. Stay with me. The scrape under the hull grew louder. For one frozen second, no one breathed. The Union sailors stood still on the deck, staring at the water as if they could see through it. The river was calm, too calm. The chains dragging behind their boat had just caught something heavy. Was it wood? Was it debris? Or was it another Confederate torpedo waiting to explode? Then the blast came. Not as powerful as the one that sank the Tecumseh, but strong enough to shake the ship hard. Water burst upward. Smoke and mud filled the air. Men were thrown down. One sailor screamed as splinters cut his arm. The ship did not sink, but it could have, and that was the point.
Even in the final months of the Civil War, when the Confederacy was collapsing, the hidden torpedoes were still there, still deadly, still turning quiet rivers into crime scenes. The clearing mission continued for hours after the explosion. Slowly, carefully, Union sailors located more underwater mines. Some were lifted out and defused. Others were detonated on purpose from a safe distance. Each explosion reminded them of one simple truth. The Confederate torpedo program had changed naval warfare forever. By early 1865, the Confederacy was falling apart. Cities were captured, armies surrendered, supplies ran out. President Jefferson Davis fled Richmond as Union troops advanced. But the torpedoes remained. They did not disappear when soldiers laid down rifles. Some were still hidden beneath rivers long after battles ended. That meant innocent vessels could strike them by accident. The danger did not vanish when the war did. Union engineers were ordered to search major waterways and remove remaining explosives. It was slow work, careful work, dangerous work. Imagine being told the war is almost over, yet you must still reach into dark water, knowing a mistake could kill you. That was the reality in the spring of 1865. Meanwhile, the men who designed the torpedoes faced uncertain futures. Gabriel J. Rains, the Confederate officer who had supported the use of mines, was taken into Union custody after the war. Unlike some Confederate leaders, he was not executed. He was questioned and later released. Why? Because by the end of the war, something had shifted. At first, many Union voices had called torpedoes cruel and dishonorable. Some politicians described them as tools of terror. Newspapers used angry language. Sailors saw them as hidden killers. But military leaders were thinking differently. They had seen how effective the mines were. They had seen how a simple explosive barrel could stop powerful ships. And quietly, they understood that underwater mines would likely become part of modern naval defense. The debate about whether torpedoes were illegal faded as time passed. Instead of banning the idea, nations began studying it. What started as a desperate Confederate tactic became a lesson in military strategy. Still, for the families of sailors who died, it did not feel like strategy. It felt like tragedy. It felt like a hidden crime beneath peaceful water. Records show that Confederate torpedoes damaged or sank several Union vessels during the war. The most famous case remained the sinking of the USS Tecumseh at Mobile Bay, but smaller explosions happened in rivers and harbors across the South. Each blast carried shock. Each blast created fear. The psychological impact may have been as powerful as the physical damage. Union sailors began to describe water differently in letters home. They wrote about mistrusting calm rivers, about scanning the surface constantly, about feeling more afraid of silence than of cannon fire. Cannon fire you could see, torpedoes you could not. After the war officially ended in April 1865, Union authorities focused on restoring order. Former Confederate soldiers were paroled. Some leaders were arrested. Military prisons slowly emptied. But what about the torpedo planters? Many returned home quietly. They were not widely prosecuted. The Union government had larger concerns: rebuilding the nation, ending slavery, beginning Reconstruction. The torpedo plot did not lead to massive public trials like the assassination of Abraham Lincoln did. It did not produce famous courtroom drama. Instead, it left behind a quieter legacy, a technological one. In the years after the war, the United States Navy began developing its own mine systems. Engineers studied designs similar to those used by the Confederacy. The idea of underwater defense was no longer shocking. It was practical. The very weapon once called cowardly was now considered clever. But there is another side to this story. For ordinary people living near southern rivers, the fear lasted longer than headlines did. Fishermen worried about unexploded mines. River traders hesitated before sending boats through former battle zones. Stories spread about hidden torpedoes still buried in mud. Some mines were discovered months after the war ended. Others likely remained lost forever. The Confederate Torpedo Plot had blurred the line between battlefield and waterway, between soldier and saboteur, between defense and terror. And it raised a question that still matters today. When does a weapon cross the line from military strategy to something more frightening? During the Civil War, the answer was unclear. Confederate leaders believed they were defending their territory using available tools. Union leaders believed they were facing dangerous sabotage. History would remember it as innovation. But for the men who heard explosions under their feet, it felt like something else. It felt like the water itself had turned against them. As Reconstruction began and the country tried to heal, the memory of torpedo explosions slowly faded from public conversation. Bigger political battles took center stage. New conflicts emerged in the American West. The nation changed. Yet underwater mines did not disappear from warfare. In future wars around the world, naval mines would sink ships and shape strategies. The concept first widely used in American waters during the Civil War became a permanent part of naval defense systems. The Confederate Torpedo Plot was not a side story.
It was a beginning of modern mine warfare, a beginning of hidden explosives beneath open seas, and a beginning of a new kind of fear of what lies unseen. Today, when we look back at 1864, we often think of famous battles, generals, and speeches, but beneath those stories lies another one. A story of secret barrels filled with gunpowder, of small boats moving at night, of sailors listening to the quiet and wondering if it would explode. The Confederate Torpedo Plot was real. It sank ships, it killed sailors, it sparked debate about the rules of war, and it proved that innovation in conflict does not always come with warning. Sometimes it waits quietly below the surface, and when it strikes, it changes everything. If this story kept you watching, remember, history is not just about loud battles and famous names. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen in silence, just before the water explodes. Stay with us for more real U.S. true crime and hidden Civil War stories that shaped America in ways most people never see. The war was over, but the river was not finished. Months after Confederate armies surrendered, a small wooden boat drifted slowly along a southern waterway. On board were 2 civilians, a trader and a teenage son. They believed the danger had passed. Cannons were silent, soldiers had gone home. The water looked peaceful. Then the river exploded. The blast tore through the bottom of the boat. Wood shattered. The trader was thrown into the water. His son disappeared in smoke and foam. There had been no battle, no warning, no enemy in sight. Only a forgotten torpedo. Even after the Confederate Torpedo Plot ended, its weapons continued to kill. This was the hidden aftermath of 1864. Union authorities had cleared many mines, but not all. Some were buried deep in mud. Some drifted from their anchors. Others were poorly mapped, their locations known only to men who never returned from the war. The government now faced a new crisis. How do you fight an enemy that is already gone? Teams of naval engineers were sent back into former war zones. Their mission was clear: find every remaining torpedo and destroy it. But the rivers were wide, the currents were strong, and the devices were small. Imagine dragging heavy iron chains across miles of water, hoping to catch a barrel filled with gunpowder before a fishing boat does. That was their job. Explosions continued through late 1865 and even into 1866. Some were controlled detonations, others were tragic accidents. Each blast was a reminder that innovation does not disappear when peace begins. Meanwhile, in Washington, military leaders quietly studied reports from the war. They reviewed damage records. They calculated how many ships were delayed, damaged, or destroyed because of underwater mines. The conclusion surprised some politicians. The torpedoes had been effective, very effective. The same weapon once condemned in newspapers was now being discussed in military offices as a valuable defensive tool. It was a strange twist of history. What had been called terror was now called strategy. Gabriel J. Rains, once criticized for promoting torpedoes, faded from public anger. He was not tried as a war criminal. He was not executed. Instead, he lived quietly after the war, because the truth was complicated. The torpedoes had targeted military ships. They were placed in active war zones.
They were not random attacks on cities. They were defensive mines meant to block invasion. Still, for the families of sailors lost in sudden explosions, that difference meant little. A blast beneath a ship feels the same no matter the reason. As Reconstruction reshaped the South, stories of underwater explosions became cautionary tales. River workers spoke of strange objects beneath the surface. Children were warned not to touch floating barrels. Fear lingered in small communities near former battle waters, but something bigger was happening. Across the Atlantic Ocean, European military observers had watched the American Civil War closely. They had seen ironclad ships clash, they had seen railroads move armies, and they had seen underwater mines sink vessels. Foreign nations began developing their own mine programs. The Confederate Torpedo Plot had sparked a global change. The weapon was no longer a desperate Southern experiment, it was the future. By the 1870s, naval mine technology had improved. Triggers became more reliable. Casings became stronger. Nations began placing mines to defend harbors around the world, and it all traced back, in part, to those muddy rivers of 1864. But let's return to the human side of the story. Think of a Union sailor standing on deck during the war. He looks down at calm water. He hears nothing but gentle waves. Then, without warning, the world explodes beneath him. That fear, that invisible threat, changed how sailors thought about water forever. Before 1864, danger came from which you could see. After 1864, danger could be hidden below. This shift mattered. It marked the beginning of modern asymmetric warfare, when a weaker force uses smart, hidden tools to fight a stronger enemy. The Confederacy could not build as many ships as the Union. It could not match industrial power, but it could plant explosives. It could turn geography into a weapon, and that idea would echo through history. In later wars, underwater mines would sink battleships, submarines, and cargo vessels. Entire naval strategies would be built around clearing minefields safely. The Confederate Torpedo Plot was not just a Civil War footnote, it was a turning point. Yet, like many turning points, it is rarely discussed in simple history lessons. We remember big battles, we remember famous speeches, but we forget the quiet fear of sailors tapping the water ahead with poles. We forget the nights when small Confederate boats slipped into dark rivers carrying barrels of gunpowder. We forget the moment when technology changed the rules of engagement, and perhaps most haunting of all, we forget that some of those torpedoes remained long after the war ended, unseen, unmoved, waiting. Even today, historians and divers occasionally uncover Civil War-era explosives in southern waterways, rusted, silent, but still dangerous. The past does not always stay buried. The Confederate Torpedo Plot was not a dramatic courtroom trial. It was not a public execution. It was not a single headline event. It was something quieter, a secret war beneath the water, a campaign of hidden explosives that forced one of the most powerful navies in the world to slow down, rethink, and adapt. It blurred the line between innovation and intimidation, between defense and terror, and it proved a powerful lesson. Sometimes the greatest threat is not what you see charging towards you, it is what lies still beneath your feet. The calm surface, the silent river, the scrape under the hull, that moment of frozen breath before the blast. The Civil War ended in 1865, but the age of underwater warfare had just begun. If this story opened your eyes to a hidden chapter of American history, remember this: true crime is not always about gangs or assassins. Sometimes it is about innovation used in desperate times. Sometimes it is about how fear travels through silence. And sometimes it is about the water beneath us and what might still be waiting there. Stay with us for more real American true crime stories that history almost buried. The river was finally quiet. No explosions, no smoke, no warships, just still water moving slowly under the morning sun. But beneath that calm surface lay a memory America would never fully erase. Years after the Civil War ended, naval officers gathered in quiet rooms to study old reports from 1864. They reread battle notes from Mobile Bay. They examined sketches of Confederate torpedoes recovered from muddy riverbeds. They looked at diagrams drawn by men who once risked their lives placing underwater mines in the dark. What they saw was simple. The Confederate Torpedo Plot had worked, not perfectly, not enough to win the war, but enough to change the future. In 1864, when Union sailors first realized explosives were hidden beneath their ships, it felt like terror. It felt unfair. It felt like the rules had been broken. But now, just a few years later,
The same government that had condemned those weapons began building its own, quietly, carefully, strategically. The United States Navy formed official mine divisions. Engineers improved trigger systems. They experimented with better waterproof casings. They studied river currents and tidal patterns to understand where underwater mines would be most effective. The very idea once described as cowardly became standard defense policy. That is how history sometimes works. What shocks one generation becomes normal to the next, but behind policy changes and engineering improvements were real human stories. Stories of sailors who never came home. Stories of families who received letters saying their loved ones were lost in sudden explosions beneath calm water. Stories of Confederate operatives who rode into the night carrying barrels of gunpowder, knowing one mistake could end their lives. The Confederate Torpedo Plot was not loud like cannon fire. It was quiet, and that quiet made it frightening. Even decades later, veterans who had served in river patrol units spoke about the fear differently. They said cannon fire was easier to face. You could duck, you could shoot back. But how do you fight something you cannot see? How do you defend against water? As America entered the late 1800s and then the 1900s, naval mines became common around the world. In future wars, thousands of ships would be damaged or destroyed by underwater explosives, but the blueprint had been tested in American rivers first. In 1864, the Confederate Torpedo Plot had shown the world that smaller forces could use intelligence and hidden technology to slow stronger enemies. It had shown that geography, rivers, bays, harbors could become weapons themselves. It had also sparked ethical debates that still continue. Is a hidden explosive different from a cannon? Is surprise attack less honorable than open battle? Where is the line between strategy and terror? These questions began in muddy southern waters and still echo in modern warfare discussions. Yet, for most Americans today, the story is almost forgotten. We remember the Battle of Gettysburg. We remember the fall of Richmond. We remember Lincoln's assassination. But we rarely remember the sailors scanning quiet rivers, tapping the water with poles, praying the next scrape would not be their last. We rarely remember the explosion that sank the USS Tecumseh in seconds at Mobile Bay. We rarely remember the Confederate engineers who turned barrels of gunpowder into invisible weapons. The Confederate Torpedo Plot did not win the Civil War,
But it left a permanent mark. It changed naval tactics. It introduced psychological warfare to American waters. It blurred the line between soldier and saboteur. And perhaps most haunting of all, it proved that danger does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it waits in silence. Imagine standing on the deck of a wooden ship in 1864. The sky is clear. The air is warm. The river looks peaceful. You hear nothing but gentle waves against the hull. Then, without warning, the world explodes beneath you. That is the moment this story is built on. A hidden device, a sudden blast, a war that moved from open fields into unseen depths. The Confederate Torpedo Plot was real. It was documented. It sank ships. It sparked fear. It reshaped military thinking, and it quietly introduced America to a new kind of warfare, one where the battlefield was not always visible. As we close this chapter, remember this: history is not just made by generals and speeches. Sometimes it is shaped by small teams working in darkness, by inventions born from desperation, by ideas that feel shocking at first and normal later. The water is calm now. The rivers are peaceful. But in 1864, they were filled with hidden fire. And that hidden fire changed the course of naval warfare forever. If this true story kept you listening, stay with us for more real American crime and war stories that reveal the moments history tried to sink beneath the surface. Because sometimes the most powerful events are the ones you never see coming. The last explosion no one expected came years later, not during battle, not during a naval operation,
but during recovery. In the late 1960s, workers clearing debris from a southern river discovered something buried in thick mud. It looked like an old metal container, rusted and half hidden beneath silt. They thought it was scrap. It was not. Moments later, the riverbank shook with a violent blast. Mud and water flew into the air. One worker was killed instantly. Others were injured. It was a Confederate torpedo, left behind, forgotten, still deadly. The Civil War had ended in 1865. The Confederacy had collapsed. Armies had surrendered. Presidents had been buried. Reconstruction had begun. But the torpedoes did not follow the rules of peace. They did not disappear when the fighting stopped. They waited. This was the final, silent chapter of the Confederate Torpedo Plot. In Washington, military officials quietly acknowledged that clearing all underwater mines would take years. Rivers shifted. Currents moved devices from their original positions. Some were buried deep enough to avoid detection. There was no dramatic trial to close this story. No grand courtroom confession. No public apology. Just reports. Reports of explosives found and destroyed, reports of accidental detonations, reports of near misses. The war had created a new kind of problem, one that lived beneath the surface. At the same time, the U.S. Navy continued developing its own controlled mine systems. What began as a Confederate defense experiment became official American naval strategy. By the 1870s, the idea of underwater mines was no longer shocking. It was organized, studied, improved. The nation had absorbed the lesson. But the emotional scar remained for those who had lived through it. Survivors of naval explosions carried memories that did not fade easily. They remembered the silence before impact, the sudden upward burst of water, the screams, the confusion, the smell of smoke mixed with river mud. They remembered not seeing the enemy, because sometimes the enemy was not a person, it was a device, a hidden mechanism, an unseen trigger waiting for contact. That was the true power of the Confederate Torpedo Plot. It forced soldiers to fear the invisible. In many ways, it marked the beginning of modern hidden warfare, where technology creates danger without warning. Today, when naval ships travel through former Civil War waters, advanced sonar scans the riverbeds. Modern engineers know exactly how to detect underwater explosives. But in 1864, there was no sonar, no advanced diving equipment, no safe removal tools. There were only ropes, chains, courage, and fear. And that fear shaped decisions. It slowed fleets. It changed battle plans. It forced one of the strongest navies in the world to adapt. The Confederate Torpedo Plot proved something powerful. A smaller force, using innovation, can challenge a stronger enemy. Not always win, but challenge. The Confederacy lost the war, but its torpedo program changed naval history. And that is what makes this story true crime in a different way. Not crime in the sense of gangs or robberies, but crime in the sense of deadly acts hidden in silence. Acts that sparked national debate. Acts that killed without warning. Acts that forced a nation to ask, is this strategy or is this terror? Even today, historians debate that question. Were torpedoes simply defensive mines placed in active war zones? Or were they early examples of psychological warfare designed to spread fear? The answer depends on perspective. For Confederate engineers, they were tools of survival. For Union sailors, they were invisible killers. For modern historians, they were the birth of naval mine warfare. And for the workers injured years later by forgotten explosives, they were proof that war's consequences do not end when peace is declared. As the 19th century moved forward, new conflicts arose, new weapons were invented. The world became more industrial, more mechanized, more dangerous. But beneath all that progress lies a simple moment from 1864. A ship gliding through calm water, a hidden device below, a sudden explosion that changed everything. The Confederate Torpedo Plot did not dominate headlines for decades. It did not become a famous courtroom drama, but it quietly shaped military thinking for generations. And it reminds us of something important. The most powerful weapons are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are silent. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they lie just beneath the surface, unseen. As we close this final chapter, picture that quiet river one last time. The surface smooth, the sky reflected in the water. No signs of danger. Now imagine knowing that beneath you is something capable of tearing your world apart in a second. That was the reality of 1864. That was the fear carried by Union sailors. That was the desperate innovation of the Confederacy. And that was the true story of the Confederate Torpedo Plot. A real event, a real weapon, a real turning point in American military history. If this true story kept you listening, remember, history is full of hidden chapters like this one. Moments that don't always make textbooks, but change the world just the same. Stay with us for more real American true crime and war stories that uncover what history tried to leave beneath the surface. Because sometimes the most powerful events are the ones you never see coming. The last explosion no one expected came years later. Not during battle, not during a naval operation, but during recovery.
In the summer of 1864, deep in Andersonville, a prison camp officially known as Camp Sumter began filling beyond anything its designers imagined. Built to hold around 10,000 Union prisoners of war, it soon held more than 3 times that number. Men captured in battles across the South were marched inside wooden stockade walls and left to survive with almost no shelter. Inside, there were no real barracks at first, only open ground. Prisoners tore blankets into scraps to build crude tents. When rain came, the camp turned into thick mud. When heat arrived, it baked the earth dry and cracked. A small stream ran through the compound, meant to provide drinking water. But with thousands of men using it for washing, waste, and survival, it quickly became contaminated. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, scurvy, and infections killed men slowly and painfully. Food was scarce and often spoiled. Rations sometimes consisted of coarse cornmeal, small portions of beans, or bits of meat crawling with insects. Starvation became common. Men grew so weak they could barely stand during roll call. Guards watched from towers along the wall, rifles ready. A thin boundary line inside the prison, known as the dead line, marked where prisoners could not step. Crossing it meant being shot without warning. The man in charge was Captain Henry Weirs, a Swiss-born Confederate officer. Prisoners later testified that he enforced strict discipline and showed little sympathy for their suffering. Whether he personally caused the conditions or simply failed to improve them became one of the biggest legal questions after the war. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, nearly 13,000 Union soldiers had died at Andersonville. It became one of the darkest prison stories in American history. Survivors described skeleton-like bodies, men fighting over crumbs of food, and the constant fear of illness. For many Americans, Andersonville symbolized cruelty and neglect behind prison walls. After the war, Henry Weirs was arrested and brought to Washington, D.C. He faced charges of conspiracy and war crimes, one of the earliest war crimes trials in U.S. history. Witnesses, many of them former prisoners, described the horrors they endured. Weirs was found guilty and executed in November 1865. Andersonville left a permanent scar. It showed how quickly overcrowding, poor food, and lack of sanitation could turn a prison into a place of mass death. It also raised a troubling question that still echoes today. When prisoners suffer in custody, who is responsible? The system or the man in charge? The wooden walls of Camp Sumter are long gone. Grass now covers the ground where thousands suffered.
But the story of Andersonville remains one of the most chilling prison crime chapters of the 1860s. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just days after the Civil War effectively ended, President Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. Washington was celebrating Union victory. The war was finally over. Crowds filled the streets with relief and hope. But inside the theater, a deadly plan was unfolding. The assassin was John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer. Furious over the South's defeat and Lincoln's support of black citizenship rights, Booth believed killing the president would revive the Confederate cause. He did not act alone. He was part of a broader conspiracy that targeted top government officials the same night. Around 10:15 p.m., Booth quietly entered the presidential box while the audience laughed at a line in the play. He fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head at close range. Chaos erupted. Booth leapt from the balcony to the stage, injuring his leg, but managing to shout a Latin phrase before escaping into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house where he died the next morning. The nation plunged in shock. After 4 brutal years of war, Americans had hoped for healing. Instead, they faced political violence at the highest level. A massive manhunt began. Federal troops searched farms, barns, and forests across Maryland and Virginia. 12 days later, Booth was found hiding in a tobacco barn. When he refused to surrender, the barn was set on fire. He was shot and died shortly afterward. Several co-conspirators were arrested, tried by military tribunal, and executed. The assassination became one of the earliest major domestic terror acts in American history, a political killing designed to destabilize the government through fear. Lincoln's death changed Reconstruction forever. His more moderate approach to rebuilding the South was replaced by harsher political battles in Congress. The fragile hope of unity grew more complicated and bitter. For prison and justice history, this case also set precedents. The use of a military tribunal instead of a civilian court sparked debate. Questions about civil liberties, wartime powers, and punishment echoed for decades. The shot fired inside Ford's Theater did more than kill a president. It altered the path of a nation. And it showed that even in moments of peace, violence can erupt with devastating consequences. In the heart of Confederate Richmond stood one of the most feared prison buildings of the Civil War, Libby Prison. Originally a tobacco warehouse, it was converted into a prison for captured Union officers. By 1864, it was dangerously overcrowded. Inside Libby Prison, conditions were harsh but different from open camps like Andersonville. Officers were kept indoors, confined in large rooms with barred windows. Food was limited, often cornbread, thin soup, and occasional scraps of meat. Prisoners suffered from cold winters and poor ventilation. Lice spread easily. Illness lingered in cramped quarters. Escape seemed almost impossible. Armed guards patrolled outside, and the building was surrounded by city streets filled with Confederate soldiers. But in early 1864, a group of Union officers began planning something bold. Using stolen tools and makeshift digging instruments, including knives and pieces of wood, they started tunneling beneath the prison floor. The digging was done slowly and secretly at night. Dirt was hidden in fireplaces and scattered carefully to avoid detection. The tunnel stretched roughly 50 feet towards a vacant lot beyond the prison walls. On the night of February 9, 1864, the plan was put into motion. One by one, Union officers slipped through the narrow tunnel. In total, 109 prisoners escaped into the dark streets of Richmond. Not all made it to freedom. Confederate patrols quickly began searching the area. By the end of the manhunt, 59 escapees were recaptured, but 50 officers successfully reached Union lines, a major embarrassment for the Confederacy. The escape became one of the most daring prison break stories of the 1860s. Northern newspapers celebrated it as proof of Union courage and determination. Southern officials tightened prison security across other facilities, fearing similar attempts. For prison history, Libby showed something powerful. Even in confinement, human beings resist.
The escape also exposed weaknesses in Confederate prison management. Security gaps, overconfidence, and overcrowding created the opportunity. It forced prison officials to rethink guard rotations, inspections, and building structure. Libby Prison would later be abandoned as Richmond fell in 1865. The building itself was eventually dismantled, but the story of the tunnel lived on. Unlike mass death camps like Andersonville, Libby became remembered for ingenuity and survival. It was not just a story of suffering, it was a story of calculated rebellion from inside prison walls.
In the larger picture of 1860s true crime and prison history, the Libby escape stands as a rare moment where prisoners outsmarted their captors. A hidden tunnel, a silent crawl through darkness, a chance at freedom beneath a city at war. In the early hours of April 27, 1865, the Mississippi River looked calm under a dark sky. The Civil War had effectively ended just weeks earlier. Confederate armies were surrendering. Prison camps were emptying. Soldiers who had survived battle and imprisonment were finally going home. But aboard the steamboat Sultana, hope was packed far too tightly. What happened that night would become the deadliest maritime disaster in American history, yet for years it was barely remembered. The Sultana was built to carry about 376 passengers. She was a wooden-hulled steamboat designed for commercial travel along the Mississippi River. In April 1865, however, she was carrying far more than her limit. After the war ended, thousands of Union prisoners were released from Confederate camps such as Andersonville Prison and Cahaba Prison. Many were sick, malnourished, and desperate to return home. Government contracts paid steamboat captains per soldier transported. The more men on board, the more money earned. The Sultana's captain, J. Cass Mason, saw an opportunity. When the boat stopped in Vicksburg, Mississippi, more than 2,000 Union soldiers were loaded aboard, most of them recently freed prisoners of war. Some estimates suggest the total number of people on board reached over 2,300. That was 6 times the vessel's capacity. Men were crammed onto every available space: decks, stairways, railings. Some slept shoulder to shoulder, others stood because there was nowhere to sit. It was overcrowding on a massive scale, not inside prison walls, but on water. Before departure, one of the Sultana's boilers had been leaking. Proper repairs would have required several days. Instead, temporary patchwork fixes were made so the boat could leave quickly. Time meant money. The Mississippi River was also swollen from spring floods, running fast and high. Navigating upstream against that current placed enormous pressure on the boat's engines. The combination was deadly. In the middle of the night, just north of Memphis, Tennessee, 3 of the Sultana's 4 boilers suddenly exploded. The blast tore through the wooden decks packed with sleeping soldiers. Fire spread instantly. Men were thrown into the freezing river. Others were crushed by collapsing structures. Within minutes, the boat was engulfed in flames. Survivors later described a scene of horror. Some men, too weak from months of imprisonment, could not swim. Others clung to debris in the icy current. The river, swollen and violent, carried bodies downstream. Rescue efforts began at daylight. Memphis residents rushed to help pull survivors from the water. Hospitals quickly filled beyond capacity. By the time it was over, an estimated 1,100 to 1,800 people had died. Exact numbers remain uncertain because passenger records were incomplete. It was a disaster greater in scale than the sinking of the Titanic decades later. Yet it faded quickly from headlines. Why? Because the nation was already overwhelmed. President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated just 12 days earlier. The country was mourning. Attention was focused on political trials and Reconstruction.
The Sultana tragedy became a footnote in a nation exhausted by war. At first glance, the explosion appeared to be a tragic mechanical failure, but investigations soon raised darker questions. Why was the boat so overcrowded? Why were faulty boilers only temporarily repaired? Why did government officials approve such a dangerous boarding process? Some historians argue corruption played a role. Government transport contracts created financial incentives to overload vessels. Bribes were rumored. Oversight was minimal in the chaotic weeks following the war's end. Captain Mason died in the explosion, meaning he could never testify. No major officials were criminally convicted. In modern terms, it might be described as criminal negligence, putting profit above human life. It also echoed a pattern seen in prison systems, overcrowding driven by financial gain or poor management, leading to deadly consequences. The Sultana had effectively become a floating extension of the prison system. Recently freed inmates were packed tightly, treated as numbers rather than individuals, and placed in dangerous conditions. Many survivors struggled for years after the disaster. Imagine surviving brutal prison camps only to face fire and freezing water days before reaching home. Some men returned to families who believed they were already dead. Others carried physical scars and trauma for life. Survivor reunions were eventually organized decades later. They sought recognition, not only for the dead, but for the forgotten scale of the tragedy. For years, the disaster received little national memorialization. Unlike battlefields with monuments and ceremonies, the Mississippi River simply flowed on. The Sultana disaster exposed weaknesses in wartime logistics and transportation oversight. It forced greater attention to steamboat safety standards. Boiler regulations slowly improved in later decades, but reform came too late for the men who died. In terms of true crime history between 1860 and 1869, the Sultana stands apart. It was not an assassination plot. It was not a prison riot. It was not a terrorist bombing. It was something quieter, systemic failure, a deadly mixture of greed, overcrowding, poor repair decisions, and rushed bureaucracy. No masked villain, no courtroom drama that delivered clear justice, just preventable death. Most of the men on board had endured brutal camps of starvation in Confederate prisons. They had survived malnutrition, disease, and despair. The war had already punished them, yet freedom came with one more cruel blow. The Sultana reminds us that danger does not always end when chains are removed. Sometimes, the systems meant to transport and protect people failed just as severely as the prisons they escaped. In many ways, it was a final tragic chapter of Civil War imprisonment, a floating overcrowded cell, a mechanical time bomb, a river that swallowed hope. Today, memorials stand near Memphis honoring the victims. Historians continue to research passenger lists, trying to identify every life lost. The story has gained more recognition in modern times, but it still remains less known than many smaller tragedies. Perhaps because it forces uncomfortable questions. How many lives were risked for profit? How many warnings were ignored? How many disasters could have been prevented? The Sultana was not sunk by enemy attack. It was destroyed by human decisions. Between 1860 and 1869, America witnessed prison horrors, political assassinations, secret war plots, and daring escapes. But the Sultana disaster stands as one of the most haunting events of that decade. It combined prison suffering, government mismanagement, and mass death in a single night. It proved that even in moments of peace, negligence can be just as deadly as war. And it left behind a lesson that echoes into modern times. Overcrowding kills. Ignored safety warnings kill. Greed kills. The Mississippi River is quiet now. Boats still travel its waters, but beneath its surface lies the memory of hundreds of soldiers who survived prison only to perish within sight of freedom. That is the story of the Sultana, a tragedy of the 1860s, a disaster born from human choices, and one of the deadliest true crime stories of post-Civil War America.
In 1864, the small town of Newburgh became the unlikely stage for a shocking prison and terror plot that could have rocked the Union from within. A group of recently captured Confederate prisoners, transported north after battlefield defeats, were housed in a makeshift military facility designed to contain only a fraction of them. But overcrowding and lax security created a volatile environment, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The conspirators were not ordinary prisoners. Many were seasoned soldiers, hardened by years of combat and desperate to return home. Anger over their imprisonment and the news of their collapsing Confederacy fueled a dangerous plan to riot, seize weapons from the armory, and potentially march on the town to create chaos. It was a plot born of fear, desperation, and a twisted sense of loyalty to the Southern cause, a real-life terror scheme inside Union territory. The riot erupted one tense evening when the prisoners attempted to break through their guards using improvised tools and makeshift weapons. Panic swept the camp. Shouts echoed through the barracks. Union officers fired warning shots, but the prisoners' determination was frighteningly intense. Civilians nearby reported seeing torches flickering through the camp windows, men scaling fences, and a flurry of chaos that could have turned into mass bloodshed. Federal reinforcements arrived just in time. The riot was suppressed, but the aftermath revealed how close the prisoners had come to creating a small-scale domestic disaster. Several ringleaders were court-martialed and imprisoned under harsher conditions, serving as a grim warning to anyone else contemplating revolt. Stories of the riot circulated in newspapers, emphasizing the fragility of security in northern prison camps and the potential for terror even far from the battlefields. The Newburgh conspiracy is often forgotten, overshadowed by headline-grabbing events like the assassination of Lincoln or the disasters of Andersonville and the Sultana. Yet it illustrates the volatile intersection of imprisonment, desperation, and human ingenuity. Overcrowded conditions, insufficient supervision, and simmering anger created a perfect storm for a crime that could have escalated dramatically. It was a chilling reminder that war's danger does not always end with surrender or borders. Even in the North, far from the Confederate heartland, prisoners could plot, revolt, and strike terror into their captors. Security, discipline, and vigilance were as crucial as courage on the battlefield. The Newburgh conspiracy ended without mass casualties, but its legacy remains as one of the earliest examples of what modern historians might call domestic terror, born from wartime imprisonment. It shows that prisons themselves, whether in the South or North, could become breeding grounds for violence, schemes, and deadly plots. In the end, Newburgh returned to calm. The prisoners were secured, the town went back to its routine, and life continued as if the riot had been only a brief shadow. But for those who survived, the memory of that night, the shouts, the desperation, the threat of uncontrolled violence lingered long after the war ended. This is the final chapter in our collection of true crime and prison stories from the 1860s, from Confederate torpedoes lurking under rivers to overcrowded steamboats, from the horrors of Andersonville to daring escapes and domestic conspiracies. This decade reminds us that the line between war, crime, and terror is often frighteningly thin. History preserves the events, but it is the human stories, fear, desperation, courage, and tragedy that continue to echo across time. The 1860s were not just a time of battles and politics, they were a decade of real crime, real suffering, and real human resilience. The stories of torpedoes, prison camps, overcrowded vessels, and conspiracies remain a testament to the extremes of human experience in one of America's most turbulent periods. If you reflect on these events, remember this: whether above water, below it, behind prison walls, or in a quiet town like Newburgh, danger can appear in the most unexpected places, and sometimes survival requires more than courage. It requires luck, ingenuity, and the will to endure. This concludes our journey through the hidden and haunting true crime stories of 1860 to 1869. If you want more real stories that history tried to hide, hit that subscribe button. Don't miss chilling tales of crime, prison, and terror from the past. Turn on notifications. We uncover them before anyone else. Join us and see the dark side of history you never knew existed.